90 Harley-Davidson motorcycles rolled into a quiet California neighborhood with the thunder of 100 storms. Neighbors grabbed their phones, ready to call police. A terrified mother watched from her window, convinced her worst nightmare was unfolding in the parking lot below. The Hell's Angels had come. Leather vests, skull patches, arms covered in intimidating ink. But they weren't there for violence or territory. They'd come for an 8-year-old boy who'd done something no adult in town had dared to do: offer help without fear. What Caleb Morrison didn't know when he helped push that 700-pound motorcycle 4 blocks was that one simple act of childhood kindness would challenge everything an entire community believed about monsters and men. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Market Street in Riverside, California, turning the cracked pavement into a patchwork of gold and gray. 8-year-old Caleb Morrison kicked a pebble along the sidewalk, his worn-out sneakers scuffing against the concrete as he made his way home from Washington Elementary. His backpack bounced against his thin shoulders with each step, stuffed with homework he'd probably tackle after helping his mum sort laundry at their apartment. The September heat still clung to the air despite the approaching evening, and Caleb could feel sweat dampening the collar of his faded blue t-shirt. He'd taken the long way home today, walking past the corner store where Mr. Chen sometimes gave him day-old pastries, past the community garden where Mrs. Patterson grew tomatoes that looked like they belonged in a magazine, and now along Market Street where the mom-and-pop shops were starting to close for the day. That's when he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the usual symphony of car horns and distant music. A deep, frustrated growl followed by the metallic clank of something heavy hitting pavement. Caleb's curiosity pulled him forward like a fish on a line. Around the corner, he found a sight that made him stop in his tracks. A massive motorcycle, all chrome and black metal, sat silent in the middle of the street, and beside it stood the biggest man Caleb had ever seen outside of a movie screen. The man had to be at least 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to block out the sun. His arms, thick as tree trunks, were covered in intricate tattoos that seemed to tell 1,000 stories. A leather vest hung over a black t-shirt, and on the back Caleb could make out a skull with wings and words he couldn't quite read from this distance. The man's face was weathered, with a salt and pepper beard, and eyes that looked tired and frustrated as he stared down at his broken machine. Caleb noticed something else too, the way people were reacting to this scene. Mrs. Fletcher from 2 blocks over had crossed to the opposite sidewalk, clutching her purse tighter. A young couple had quickened their pace, heads down, avoiding eye contact. Even Mr. Bradley, who usually stopped to chat with everyone, had suddenly found something fascinating to look at in a shop window. The big man seemed to notice it too. His jaw tightened, and something that looked like sadness flickered across his face before he turned back to his motorcycle, running a hand through his graying hair. Caleb didn't understand why everyone was acting so strange. His mom had taught him to help people when they needed it, and this man clearly needed help. The 8-year-old approached slowly, his voice small but clear in the heavy silence. "Mister, is your motorcycle broken?" The man's head snapped up, surprise evident in his brown eyes. He looked at Caleb as if seeing a ghost, then glanced around as if expecting someone to call the boy back to pull him away to safety. When no one did, he crouched down to Caleb's level, and his gruff voice softened considerably. "Yeah, kid. She died on me right here, won't start, won't do nothing." "That's not good," Caleb said seriously, stepping closer to examine the motorcycle with the intense focus only a child can muster. "My mom's car broke once. We had to push it to the gas station. It was really hard." The corner of the man's mouth twitched, almost forming a smile. "I bet it was. This bike's even heavier than most cars." "Where do you need to go?" "There's a shop about 4 blocks that way." The man pointed down Market Street. "Tommy's garage. He knows these bikes. But I can't push this thing by myself, and—" He trailed off, glancing at the pedestrians who were still giving them a wide berth. Caleb didn't need to hear the rest. He dropped his backpack on the sidewalk, rolled up his sleeves in a gesture he'd seen his mom do 100 times when she meant business, and positioned himself at the back of the motorcycle. "I'll help you push it." The man blinked, and for a moment something powerful crossed his face, an emotion Caleb was too young to identify, but would remember for the rest of his life. It was the look of someone who'd been invisible for so long they'd forgotten what it felt like to be seen. "Kid, I appreciate it, but you're awful small for a job like this." "I'm strong," Caleb insisted, planting his feet firmly. "My mom says I've got the heart of a lion. That's got to count for something, right?" This time, the man did smile, a genuine warm smile that transformed his intimidating face into something almost gentle. "All right then, little lion. Let's give it a shot. You push from there, I'll steer and push from up front. 4 blocks. Think you can make it?" "Yes, sir." "Name's Marcus," the man said, extending a massive hand that completely engulfed Caleb's small one. "But people call me Reaper." "I'm Caleb. That's a cool name. Why do they call you that?" Marcus, Reaper, laughed, a sound like distant thunder. "That's a story for when you're older, kid. Come on, let's get this beast moving." They started pushing, and immediately Caleb understood why everyone had walked away. The motorcycle was impossibly heavy, like trying to move a small building. But he dug his sneakers into the pavement and pushed with everything he had, his face scrunching up with effort, small grunts escaping his lips. Reaper glanced back every few seconds, clearly ready to tell the kid to stop, that this was too much. But Caleb's determination was absolute. His thin arms trembled, sweat beaded on his forehead, but he kept pushing. "You're doing great, Caleb," Reaper encouraged, his own muscles straining as he guided the heavy Harley down the street. "Real great." They moved slowly, painfully slowly, drawing stares from everyone they passed. Caleb could hear whispered conversations, feel the weight of judgment from strangers, but he didn't understand it. He was just helping someone. Wasn't that what people were supposed to do? By the second block, Caleb's legs were burning. By the third, his arms felt like rubber. But Reaper kept talking to him, telling him stories about riding across the country, about seeing the sunrise over the Grand Canyon, about the freedom of the open road. The stories made Caleb forget the pain, made him imagine himself on one of those highways, wind in his hair, nothing but possibility ahead. "Almost there, little man," Reaper said as Tommy's garage came into view. "One more block. You've got this." Caleb summoned every ounce of strength left in his small body and pushed. His sneakers slipped on the pavement, but he recovered, pushing harder. People had stopped to watch now, though Caleb didn't notice. He was too focused on reaching that garage, on finishing what he'd started. When they finally rolled the Harley into Tommy's parking lot, Caleb collapsed against the bike, breathing hard, his shirt soaked through with sweat. Reaper was breathing hard too, but his face was split in a grin. "You did it, kid. I can't believe it, but you actually did it." A stocky Hispanic man in grease-stained coveralls emerged from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. His eyes widened when he saw Reaper, then dropped to Caleb, then back to Reaper with obvious confusion. "Marcus, what happened to your ride?" "Died on Market Street, Tommy. This is Caleb. He pushed the whole 4 blocks with me." Tommy Rodriguez looked at the small, exhausted boy with something close to disbelief. 4 blocks? Kid, that bike weighs over 700 pounds. Caleb straightened up, pride cutting through his exhaustion. "I'm strong." Both men laughed, but it was warm laughter, the kind that made Caleb feel good rather than small. "Tommy, can you take a look at her?" Reaper asked. "Course, brother. Probably the fuel pump again. I'll have her running in a day or 2. Tommy crouched down to Caleb's level. "You want a soda, champ? I got some cold ones in the back." Before Caleb could answer, the roar of an approaching engine made them all turn. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb, and Kennedy Morrison practically flew out of the driver's seat, her face a mask of panic and fury. "Caleb Morrison, get away from them right now." Caleb's stomach dropped. He knew that tone. It was the tone his mom used when he'd done something seriously wrong, except he couldn't figure out what he'd done this time. Kennedy rushed forward, placing herself between her son and the two men, her whole body rigid with protective fear. She was still wearing her waitress uniform from the diner, her name tag slightly crooked, her brown hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. At 5'6", she looked impossibly small compared to Reaper, but she stood her ground, like a cornered animal protecting its young. "Ma'am," Reaper started, holding up his hands in a placating gesture. "Don't you ma'am me!" Kennedy snapped, her voice shaking. "Stay away from my son." "Mom, it's okay," Caleb tried to explain. "His motorcycle broke and I was just—" "Get in the car, Caleb, now." "But Mom, now." Caleb had never heard his mother sound so scared and angry at the same time. Confused and hurt, he grabbed his backpack from where Reaper had carried it and trudged toward the car, tears stinging his eyes. Kennedy followed, keeping her body between the men and her son. Just before she reached the car, Reaper's voice cut through the tension. "He's a good kid, Mom. One of the best people I've met in years." Kennedy didn't respond. She shoved Caleb into the car, climbed into the driver's seat, and peeled away from the curb with enough force to leave rubber on the pavement. The ride home was silent, except for Caleb's quiet sniffles. He stared out the window, trying to understand what he'd done wrong, why his mom was so upset. He'd just been helping. That's what good people did. When they pulled up to their apartment complex, a faded two-story building with chipping paint and a parking lot full of potholes, Kennedy finally spoke. "Caleb, do you have any idea what you just did? I helped someone whose motorcycle broke. You put yourself in danger with a member of the Hells Angels." The words burst out of Kennedy like she'd been holding them back with all her strength. "Do you know what that means? Do you know what those people are?" Caleb shook his head, genuinely confused. Kennedy pulled into their assigned spot and killed the engine, turning to face her son. Her hands were shaking, and Caleb realized with a jolt that she'd been crying. "Baby, the Hells Angels are a motorcycle gang. They're criminals, dangerous people. You cannot just walk up to them and—" Her voice broke. "You could have been hurt. You could have been taken. You could have—" "But he wasn't dangerous, Mom. He was nice. He told me stories about the Grand Canyon. Caleb, you're 8 years old. You don't understand." "He was sad, Mom." Kennedy stopped mid-sentence, blinking at her son. "Everyone was crossing the street away from him," Caleb continued, his voice small but certain. "Everyone was scared, and he looked so sad, like when I got picked last for dodgeball and nobody wanted to be my partner. That kind of sad." Kennedy closed her eyes, taking a shaky breath. When she opened them again, they were filled with a complicated mix of emotions: fear, exhaustion, pride, worry. "Baby, listen to me. The world isn't always simple. Sometimes people who seem nice can be dangerous. I need you to be more careful. I need you to think before you—" She stopped, running a hand through her hair. "I can't lose you. You're all I have." Caleb unbuckled his seatbelt and hugged his mother as tightly as his small arms could manage. "I'm sorry I scared you, Mom." Kennedy held him close, breathing in the scent of his strawberry shampoo mixed with sweat and concrete dust. "Let's go inside. You need a shower, and I need to figure out what to tell the neighbors when they inevitably ask about this." As if on cue, Mrs. Fletcher appeared on her front steps, arms crossed, her face pinched with disapproval. "Kennedy Morrison, I saw your boy with those thugs on Market Street. What were you thinking? Letting him—" "Not now, Deborah," Kennedy said firmly, guiding Caleb toward their apartment. "Not now." Inside their small two-bedroom apartment, Caleb headed straight for the shower, while Kennedy collapsed onto their worn couch, still wearing her uniform, still processing what had happened. She'd been at the diner when Mrs. Patterson had called, breathless with concern, saying she'd seen Caleb pushing a motorcycle with one of those Hell's Angels criminals. Kennedy had left her shift early, risking her job, driven by pure maternal terror. But now, sitting in the quiet of her home, she kept hearing Caleb's words. He looked so sad. Her son, with his pure heart and inability to see the divisions adults created, had looked at a man covered in intimidating tattoos and symbols of rebellion and seen only another human being who needed help. Kennedy didn't know whether to be proud or terrified. Probably both. In the bathroom, Caleb stood under the warm spray, watching the dust and sweat circle the drain. He understood his mom was scared, but he still didn't understand why. Marcus, Reaper, had been kind. He'd smiled. He'd shared stories. He'd called Caleb Little Lion. That didn't seem dangerous at all. As the water washed away the physical evidence of his afternoon adventure, Caleb made a decision. He might not understand the adult world and all its complicated rules about who to fear and who to trust, but he knew one thing for certain. Helping someone who needed it was never wrong, even if it scared his mom half to death. The next 3 days passed in a strange tension that hung over the Morrison household like humidity before a storm. Kennedy had explicitly forbidden Caleb from going anywhere near Market Street or Tommy's garage, a restriction that seemed to physically pain the 8-year-old every time he thought about it. He wanted to know if Reaper's motorcycle had been fixed, wanted to know if the big man with the sad eyes had made it home okay. At Washington Elementary, Caleb's teacher, Ms. Rivera, noticed he was more distracted than usual, staring out the classroom window instead of focusing on his math worksheets. During recess, instead of playing tag with his friends, he sat under the big oak tree, drawing motorcycles in the dirt with a stick. "You okay, Caleb?" His friend Marcus, a different Marcus, a 10-year-old with braces and a skateboard obsession, asked during lunch on Wednesday. "Yeah," Caleb lied, pushing his cafeteria pizza around his tray. "Just thinking." "About what?" "About how adults see stuff different than kids." Marcus, the classmate, gave him a confused look and went back to trading Pokemon cards with another boy. Caleb sighed. Some thoughts were too big to explain, even to friends. Meanwhile, Kennedy Morrison was discovering that small-town gossip traveled faster than wildfire and burned just as hot. At the diner where she worked the morning and afternoon shifts, the conversation seemed to circle back to her son and that incident with uncomfortable regularity. "I'm just saying, Kennedy, you need to be more careful," said her co-worker Linda, a woman in her 50s who'd been waitressing since before Kennedy was born. "Those Hell's Angels are bad news. Everyone knows it." Kennedy poured coffee for a customer with more force than necessary. "He's 8, Linda. He saw someone who needed help and helped them. Should I punish him for having a good heart?" "You should teach him to be smart," interjected another co-worker, Gary, from behind the grill. "Smart and good ain't always the same thing." Kennedy didn't respond, but the words stung because they echoed her own internal conflict. She was proud of Caleb's compassion, terrified of his naivety, and exhausted from trying to reconcile the two. What she didn't know was that 4 blocks away, in a garage that smelled of motor oil and old coffee, a very different conversation was taking place. Marcus Reaper Donovan sat on a folding chair in Tommy's garage, watching the mechanic work on the Harley's fuel system. The bike was almost fixed. Tommy had been right about the fuel pump, but Reaper found himself reluctant to leave. "That kid," Tommy said, not looking up from his work. "That was something else, man. How old did you say he was?" 8. Barely 4 feet tall, probably weighs 70 pounds soaking wet, and he pushed this 700-pound bike 4 blocks without complaining once. Tommy whistled low. "What did you say his name was?" "Caleb. Caleb Morrison. And his mom came to get him?" Like a protective lioness, Reaper said, a slight smile on his face despite the memory of her fear and anger. Can't say I blame her. I know what we look like to civilians, especially to a single mom trying to keep her kids safe. Tommy set down his wrench and looked at his friend seriously. You thinking what I think you're thinking? I'm thinking that kid showed me more kindness in 15 minutes than I've seen from so-called respectable people in 15 years. I'm thinking he deserves better than to be yelled at for doing something good. I'm thinking... Reaper stopped, running a hand over his beard. I don't know, Tommy. I just can't stop thinking about it. You called Chains yet? Vincent Chains Sullivan was the president of the Riverside chapter of the Hells Angels, a man whose reputation preceded him like thunder before lightning. At 52, with silver threading through his black hair and scars that told stories he'd never voluntarily share, Chains had led the chapter for over a decade, with a firm hand and an even firmer set of principles. Not yet, Reaper admitted. I wanted to get my head straight first. Well, your ride's ready, Tommy said, gesturing to the gleaming Harley. Runs better than before, actually. That fuel pump was probably on its way out for a while. Reaper stood, pulling out his wallet, but Tommy waved him off. On the house, brother. Consider it payment for telling me about that kid. Restored my faith in the next generation. Reaper clasped Tommy's hand firmly. I owe you. You owe that boy, Tommy corrected. Question is, what are you going to do about it? That question followed Reaper as he rode through Riverside, the Harley purring beneath him like a satisfied cat. The sun was starting its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded him why he loved California, despite everything. He found himself riding past the Morrisons' apartment complex without consciously deciding to go there. It was a modest building in a modest neighborhood, the kind of place where people worked hard, worried about bills, and tried to give their kids a better life than they'd had. Reaper didn't stop, didn't even slow down, but he noticed things. The number on the building, the faded playground equipment in the courtyard, the basketball hoop with no net, the way some windows had curtains and others had bedsheets. This was where his little helper lived. This was the world Caleb Morrison was growing up in. Reaper rode on, but his mind was made up. He pulled into the parking lot of Rosie's Bar, the unofficial headquarters of the Riverside Hells Angels, and killed his engine. Inside, he could hear the familiar sounds of brotherhood, laughter, the crack of pool balls, classic rock playing on the jukebox. The moment he walked in, several heads turned. His brothers knew that look on his face, the one that said he had something to say and wasn't leaving until he'd said it. Chains sat at the bar, nursing a whiskey, his leather vest adorned with patches that marked years of loyalty and leadership. When he saw Reaper, he nodded toward an empty stool. Heard you had bike trouble. Had, Reaper confirmed, settling onto the stool. Tommy fixed her up. But that's not what I want to talk to you about. Then talk. Reaper told the story, all of it. The breakdown on Market Street, the pedestrians crossing away, the small voice asking if he needed help, the 4-block push, the kid's determination, the mother's fear. He told it plainly, without embellishment, because the truth was powerful enough on its own. When he finished, Chains was quiet for a long moment, swirling the whiskey in his glass. Around them, the bar had gradually fallen silent as other members had drifted over to listen. Kid did that? Smokey, a barrel-chested man with a grey beard, just walked up and helped. Didn't even hesitate, Reaper confirmed, and his mom, scared out of her mind, thought I was going to hurt him or something. Chains set down his glass with a decisive clink. How old? 8. Name? Caleb Morrison. Lives over on Oakwood, those apartments near the elementary school. Chains stood, and when the chapter president stood with purpose, everyone paid attention. Here's what we're going to do, he said, his voice carrying the weight of authority that had kept 90 men unified for over a decade. We're going to show that kid, and his mom, and this whole damn town, what the Hells Angels really stand for. "What are you thinking, Chains?" asked Brutus, a younger member with arms like steel cables. "I'm thinking we ride, all of us. We go to that boy's house and we thank him proper." "Chains," Reaper said carefully. "His mom was terrified of me. If 90 of us show up, then maybe she'll finally see we're not what she thinks we are," Chains interrupted. "Maybe this whole neighborhood will. We've been the boogeyman in Riverside long enough. Time to show them different." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the bar. These were men who'd been judged, dismissed, feared and hated based on their appearance for most of their adult lives. The idea of being seen differently, of a child's simple act of kindness being honored and returned, resonated with something deep in their collective soul. "What are we bringing?" asked Snake, the chapter's road captain. Chains smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd just found a purpose he didn't know he'd been missing. Everything. We bring everything. Over the next 2 days, the Riverside chapter of the Hells Angels became a hive of activity that would have shocked anyone who believed the stereotypes. Money was collected, not demanded, but freely given. Phone calls were made to brothers in other chapters, to businesses who owed favors, to connections built over decades of existing in the margins of society. They learned everything they could about Caleb Morrison through careful, respectful inquiry. Tommy mentioned to his cousin who worked at the school that they were interested in doing something nice. The cousin, sworn to secrecy, mentioned that Caleb was a good kid, loved dinosaurs and space, and had worn the same pair of too small sneakers for the past 6 months. They learned about Kennedy Morrison too. Single mom, worked double shifts, struggled to make rent, did everything in her power to give her son opportunities she'd never had. Proud, hard-working, scared of letting her kid down. This information didn't come from stalking or intimidation. It came from what it always came from in small communities. People talking to people, connections flowing through invisible channels, the same gossip network that had spread fear about the Hells Angels, now inadvertently providing information to help them. On Friday evening, Chains stood in the center of Rosie's bar, surrounded by his chapter. The back room was piled with purchases, toys, clothes, gift certificates, a brand new bicycle that Brutus had insisted on buying personally, school supplies, groceries, and more. "Brothers," Chains said, and 90 men fell silent. "Tomorrow, we ride to show Riverside what we really are. We ride to honor a kid who saw past the leather and the patches and the tattoos to help another human being. We ride to prove that respect and gratitude aren't exclusive to the so-called respectable." "And if the mom calls the cops?" someone asked. "Then we deal with that respectfully too," Chains replied. "We're not going there to intimidate. We're going to thank a child and maybe, just maybe, change some minds about who we are." Reaper stood among his brothers, feeling something he hadn't felt in years, hope. Hope that Caleb's simple act of kindness might be the crack in the wall that separated them from the rest of society. Hope that for once they might be seen as human beings rather than stereotypes. "Roll out at 10 a.m., Chains announced. "Clean vests, best behavior. We're representing the entire brotherhood tomorrow. Make sure you're worthy of it." That night, in her small apartment, Kennedy Morrison sat at her kitchen table, reviewing bills she couldn't pay and trying to figure out how to explain to Caleb that his birthday was coming up and there wouldn't be much to celebrate this year. She'd already worked extra shifts, already cut every corner she could find. In his room, Caleb lay in bed, staring at the glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to his ceiling, thinking about a man called Reaper who'd looked so sad when people crossed the street away from him. Thinking about kindness, and why it sometimes seemed to make adults angry instead of happy. Neither of them knew that tomorrow their quiet lives were about to be transformed in a way that would challenge everything they thought they knew about judgment, generosity, and the true meaning of brotherhood. Saturday morning dawned clear and bright. The kind of Southern California day that travel brochures promised. The sky stretched out in endless blue, and the temperature was perfect, warm but not hot, with just enough breeze to carry the scent of eucalyptus from the trees that lined Riverside streets. Kennedy had the weekend off for once, and she'd planned to use it catching up on laundry, cleaning the apartment, and maybe taking Caleb to the park if her budget allowed for ice cream afterward. Simple plans for a simple life. Caleb was in the living room watching Saturday morning cartoons with his cereal bowl balanced on his knees when the sound started. At first it was distant, easy to dismiss as traffic on the highway, but it grew louder, deeper, more insistent, a rumble that seemed to shake the very air. Kennedy was folding laundry in her bedroom when she heard it too. She frowned, walking to the window, and her heart stopped. Motorcycles, dozens of motorcycles, and they were turning into her apartment complex. "Caleb, stay inside," she shouted, rushing to the living room just as her son pressed his face against the window, eyes wide with wonder. The rumble grew to a roar as one after another, gleaming motorcycles rolled into the parking lot, Harleys mostly, chrome catching the sunlight, engines purring in a symphony of controlled power. Kennedy watched in frozen horror as they kept coming, filling the parking lot, lining the street more than she could count. And each rider wore the same vest, the same patch. Hell's Angels. "Mom, look, it's so many motorcycles." Caleb's voice was filled with pure excitement, innocent of the terror gripping his mother's heart. Kennedy grabbed her phone, hand shaking, as she prepared to dial 911. This was it. Whatever she'd feared when Caleb had helped that man, it was happening. They'd come for revenge, or recruitment, or some purpose she couldn't fathom but knew would be terrible. Then she noticed something odd. The riders were shutting off their engines in an organized manner, creating quiet in waves. No one was revving engines or making aggressive moves. They were just parking. Orderly. Calm. Chains was the first to dismount, his silver-streaked hair pulled back, his leather vest impeccable. He looked around the parking lot, then directly up at Kennedy's window and, impossibly, he smiled and waved. "What the—" Kennedy breathed. More riders dismounted. Some went to the back of bikes, others to saddlebags, all moving with purpose but no urgency. And then Kennedy saw him, the man from the garage, Reaper, carrying something large and wrapped in bright paper. Neighbors were emerging now, drawn by the spectacle. Mrs. Fletcher stood on her balcony, one hand over her heart, phone in the other, probably already calling the police. Mr. Bradley had come out of his apartment looking confused but curious. Families with children clustered in doorways, watching. A knock on the door made Kennedy jump. She looked at Caleb, who was already moving toward the door with the fearless enthusiasm of childhood. "Caleb Morrison, you stay right there," Kennedy commanded, using her most serious mom voice. She approached the door with her phone still in hand, triple-checking that the chain lock was engaged before opening it just a crack. Chains stood on the other side, alone, his hands visible and empty, his expression open and non-threatening. Behind him, Kennedy could see the gathered riders, but they'd kept a respectful distance from the apartment. "Mrs. Morrison," Chains said, his voice surprisingly gentle for such an imposing man. "My name is Vincent Sullivan. I'm the president of the Riverside Hells Angels. May I have a moment of your time?" "What do you want?" Kennedy's voice shook despite her best efforts to sound strong. "We want to thank your son." Kennedy blinked. Of all the things she'd expected to hear, that wasn't among them. "Thank him?" "Ma'am, what your boy did the other day, helping my brother Marcus when his bike broke down, that was something special. In a world where people cross the street when they see us coming, your son walked right up and offered help. No fear, no judgment, just pure kindness." Chains paused, and his voice grew even softer. "We want to honor that." "By bringing 90 bikers to my home?" The words came out sharper than Kennedy intended, but fear made her defensive. "Yes, ma'am, because one person's kindness deserves a community's gratitude, because your son needs to know that what he did mattered, and because—" The Chains looked directly into her eyes, and she saw something there she didn't expect. Sincerity, because we want you and this neighborhood to see us as we really are. And what are you really? Men who value loyalty, respect, and family above all else. Men who've been judged unfairly. Men who recognize a pure heart when we see one. Chains stepped back slightly, giving her space. "Mrs. Morrison, I give you my word, on my honor and the honor of every man here, we mean no harm. We're just here to say thank you, nothing more, nothing less." Kennedy looked past him at the assembled riders. They weren't revving engines or shouting or doing any of the threatening things she'd imagined. They were just standing there, waiting. Some were smiling. One older rider was holding a massive teddy bear. A teddy bear. "Mom, please!" Caleb's voice came from behind her, small and hopeful. "I want to see Reaper." That decided it. Kennedy took a deep breath, sent up a prayer to whatever might be listening, and removed the chain lock. She opened the door fully, keeping Caleb slightly behind her, and stepped out onto the small concrete porch. The sight that greeted her was surreal. 90 motorcycles gleaming in the morning sun, 90 riders, leather-clad and tattooed, standing in respectful silence. And in the center of it all, Marcus Reaper Donovan, holding a wrapped bicycle and wearing the biggest smile she'd ever seen on such an intimidating face. "Hi, Mrs. Morrison," Reaper said. "Mind if we give your son some gifts?" Before Kennedy could answer, Caleb darted around her legs and ran straight to Reaper, who crouched down to the boy's level, setting the bike aside to receive the enthusiastic hug Caleb threw at him. "You came back. Is your motorcycle all better?" "Better than ever, little lion. All thanks to you." Chains nodded, and something magical happened. The riders moved as one, bringing forward the pile of gifts they'd assembled. The teddy bear came first, presented by a grizzled rider whose vest showed he'd been in the club since the 70s. Then came the bicycle, a beautiful blue mountain bike with training wheels carefully installed. Then clothes, toys, a telescope for stargazing, art supplies, sports equipment. But it wasn't just for Caleb. Someone brought forward bags of groceries, quality food, not the discount brands Kennedy usually bought, gift certificates to local restaurants, an envelope that Chains pressed into Kennedy's hand with a quiet, "For rent or bills or whatever you need, no strings." Kennedy opened the envelope with shaking hands and nearly dropped it. There had to be $2,000 inside. "This is too much," she whispered, tears starting to flow despite her best efforts to hold them back. "This is way too much." "Ma'am, your son spent his strength pushing a 700-pound motorcycle 4 blocks in the heat," Chain said. "This isn't too much. This isn't nearly enough." Around the parking lot, neighbors had crept closer, drawn by curiosity and the increasingly obvious fact that this wasn't a violent confrontation. Children pointed at the motorcycles, asking their parents questions. Adults watched with expressions ranging from confusion to dawning understanding. Mrs. Fletcher had lowered her phone, her call to police apparently forgotten or dismissed. Mr. Bradley had actually walked down to the edge of the gathering, watching with open fascination. Caleb was being passed from rider to rider, each one shaking his small hand, thanking him, many with tears in their own eyes. These men, hardened by lives that had been anything but easy, were being undone by an 8-year-old's simple goodness. "Why are you really doing this?" Kennedy asked Chains quietly, while Caleb was distracted. Chains looked at her seriously. "Because we're tired of being monsters in people's stories, Mrs. Morrison. We're tired of being feared when we're just trying to live our lives. Your son didn't see a monster. He saw a man who needed help, and he helped. That's rare. That's precious. And if we can't honor that kind of purity, what kind of men are we? Kennedy looked at her son, laughing as a rider named Brutus let him sit on his motorcycle and make pretend engine noises. She looked at the gifts, the money, the faces of men who'd been written off by society, but were showing more generosity than most respectable people she knew. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, the words bursting out. "I'm sorry I grabbed him away. I'm sorry I assumed the worst. I was just protecting your child," Chains finished. "Never apologize for that. But maybe now you can see we're not what you thought." "Maybe I can," Kennedy admitted, wiping her eyes. A police car rolled up, lights off, but clearly responding to a call. Officer Davis, a 20-year veteran of the Riverside PD, got out warily, hand near his weapon, clearly expecting trouble. What he found instead was a street party. Chains walked over immediately, hands visible, movements non-threatening. "Morning, Officer Davis." "What's going on here, Sullivan?" "A boy helped one of our members when his bike broke down. We came to say thank you. No trouble, no violations, just gratitude." Officer Davis looked around, taking in the scene. The smiling child, the crying mother, the gifts, the respectful demeanor of the riders. He'd been a cop long enough to recognize the difference between posturing and genuine emotion. "Well," he said slowly, "I got a call about a disturbance." "No disturbance here, officer," Kennedy said, stepping forward. "These men they're thanking my son. They're being kind." Officer Davis had responded to plenty of calls involving the Hells Angels over the years. Noise complaints mostly, the occasional bar fight, traffic violations. He'd never seen anything like this. He looked at Chains, then at Kennedy, then at little Caleb Morrison, who was now wearing a leather vest that hung on him like a dress, giggling as the riders called him Little Brother. "All right then," Officer Davis said finally. "Keep it peaceful, keep the noise reasonable, and have a good day." As the officer drove away, something shifted in the parking lot. It was subtle, but Kennedy felt it. A relaxation, an opening. The neighbors who'd been watching from a distance started coming closer. Mr. Bradley actually shook Chains's hand. A young mother asked Brutus about his motorcycle, and he spent 10 minutes explaining the mechanical details with surprising gentleness. Mrs. Fletcher remained on her balcony, but Kennedy noticed she wasn't frowning anymore, just watching, thinking. The celebration, because that's what it had become, lasted over an hour. Riders shared stories of their own acts of kindness received over the years, the random strangers who'd helped them when they were stranded or struggling. They talked about the code they lived by, the values they held, the family they'd created. Caleb absorbed it all with the sponge-like attention of childhood, asking questions that made the riders laugh and sometimes think hard before answering. "Why do people cross the street when they see you?" he asked Chains at one point. Chains crouched down, taking the question seriously. "Because people are scared of what they don't understand, little brother. We look different, we live different, and that scares them. But you didn't see all that. You just saw someone who needed help." "Because helping is good," Caleb said simply. "Because helping is good," Chains agreed. "You remember that, Caleb Morrison. No matter what anyone tells you, helping people is always good." As the gathering finally began to wind down, Reaper pulled Kennedy aside while other riders were loading the gifts into her apartment with respectful efficiency. "Ma'am, I want you to know, your son changed something in me that day. I'd gotten used to the looks, the fear, the judgment. I'd started to believe maybe I was what they thought I was, and then this tiny kid walks up and just sees me. Really sees me. Not the vest, not the tattoos, just a person who needed help." Reaper's voice was rough with emotion. "He reminded me there's still good in the world. That's worth more than all these gifts combined." Kennedy found she couldn't speak past the lump in her throat, so she just nodded. The riders began mounting their bikes, the organized chaos of departure beginning. But before they left, they formed two lines creating a path, and Caleb walked between them, like a tiny general reviewing his troops. Each rider saluted him, fist to heart, and Caleb saluted back with the seriousness of a child who understood this was important, even if he didn't fully understand why. When the last motorcycle roared to life, Chains approached Kennedy one final time. "We have a saying, Mrs. Morrison. When we do right, nobody remembers. When we do wrong, nobody forgets. Today, we did right. I hope you'll remember." "I will," Kennedy promised. "We both will." The motorcycles rolled out in formation, the rumble of their engines fading as they disappeared into riverside streets, leaving behind a parking lot full of stunned neighbors, an apartment full of gifts, and two people whose worldview had been fundamentally challenged. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the Morrison apartment windows as Kennedy and Caleb sat surrounded by the remnants of the morning's extraordinary event. The living room looked like Christmas had exploded, boxes and bags everywhere, the new bicycle leaning against the wall, the massive teddy bear occupying an entire corner of the couch. Caleb was methodically examining each gift, his small face serious with concentration as he appreciated every item. He'd already changed into one of the new outfits, jeans that actually fit, and a t-shirt with a dinosaur on it that made him smile every time he looked down. Kennedy sat on the floor, the envelope of money in her lap, still trying to process what had happened. She kept picking it up, counting it, putting it down, as if the bills might disappear if she didn't keep confirming their reality. $2,000, enough to pay rent for 2 months. Enough to buy Caleb new shoes that actually fit. Enough to fix the rattling noise in her car that she'd been ignoring for months. Enough to breathe. "Mom, look," Caleb said, holding up the telescope. "Reaper said this can show me the rings around Saturn. Can we go outside tonight and look?" "Yeah, baby, we can do that." "And Mom?" Caleb set down the telescope and came to sit beside her, his expression unusually contemplative for an 8-year-old. "Were you wrong about Reaper and his friends?" Kennedy thought carefully about how to answer. She didn't want to teach her son that her protective instincts were wrong, but she also couldn't deny what they'd witnessed. "I was scared," she said finally. "And sometimes when we're scared, we believe things about people that aren't true. The Hells Angels have a reputation, some of it deserved, some of it not. I reacted to the reputation instead of the person." "So they're not bad?" I think they're complicated, like most people. They made choices I wouldn't make. They live differently than we do, but that doesn't make them monsters." Kennedy pulled Caleb into a hug. "What you did, helping Reaper, that was good and brave. I shouldn't have yelled at you for it." "You were just scared," Caleb said generously. "It's okay to be scared sometimes." Kennedy laughed, amazed at her son's ability to forgive and understand. "When did you get so wise?" "I'm 8.5, Caleb said seriously. "That's basically ancient." A knock on the door interrupted their moment. Kennedy tensed automatically, but when she opened it, she found not a leather-clad biker, but Mrs. Fletcher holding a casserole dish. "Kennedy," the older woman said, and there was something different in her expression. Less judgment, more curiosity. "I brought over some lasagna. Thought you might not feel like cooking after this morning's excitement." Kennedy accepted the dish, stunned. Mrs. Fletcher had lived in the complex for 5 years and had never brought over food before, had never done anything but offer criticism and disapproval. "Thank you, Deborah. That's very kind." Mrs. Fletcher glanced past Kennedy at the pile of gifts visible in the living room. "Those men, they really just came to thank Caleb." "They really did." "I'll be honest, Kennedy. I called the police. I was sure they were here to cause trouble. I almost did the same thing." Fletcher was quiet for a moment, then said, "My son has a motorcycle, not a Harley, just a little Honda, but when he visits some of the neighbors—" She stopped, seeming to realize something. "We judge quickly, don't we? We see the surface and think we know the whole story." "We do," Kennedy agreed softly. After Mrs. Fletcher left, more neighbors began stopping by. Mr. Bradley wanted to hear about the motorcycles. A young couple from upstairs asked if Caleb would like to play with their daughter sometime. Even the apartment manager, usually all business, came by to say he'd heard what happened and thought it was really something. By evening, what had started as an isolated family's encounter with the Hells Angels had become a neighborhood talking point, a story that was being retold and re-examined, forcing people to reconsider assumptions they'd held for years. Kennedy made dinner using some of the groceries the riders had brought: real butter, fresh vegetables, good meat. And as she and Caleb ate at their small kitchen table, she found herself thinking about Chain's words. "We're tired of being monsters in people's stories." How many other groups, other individuals, were living under the weight of assumptions and stereotypes? How many good people were being judged by appearance, association, or reputation rather than character? "Mom," Caleb said through a mouthful of mashed potatoes, "can I write Reaper a thank you note?" "You want to thank him? Baby, they brought you all those gifts." "But he told me stories about the Grand Canyon when we were pushing the motorcycle. That was nice. I want to say thank you for the stories." Kennedy felt her eyes sting with tears for what had to be the 100th time that day. "Yes, sweetie, we can do that." After dinner, they sat together at the kitchen table, and Caleb carefully wrote out a note in his still-developing handwriting. "Dear Reaper, thank you for the presents. Thank you for the stories about the Grand Canyon. I had fun helping you. You're not scary. You're nice. Can you tell me more stories sometime? Your friend, Caleb." Kennedy added her own note on a separate page. "Marcus and Vincent and all the brothers, I don't have adequate words to express my gratitude for what you did today. You didn't just give my son gifts. You gave him validation that kindness matters, that helping others is never wrong. You gave me a perspective I desperately needed. Thank you for showing us who you really are. With sincere appreciation, Kennedy Morrison." They addressed the envelope to Tommy's garage, figuring that was the best way to ensure it reached the right people, and Kennedy promised they'd mail it first thing Monday morning. That night, as promised, they took the telescope outside. The apartment complex had a small courtyard with dying grass and broken benches, but when Caleb pointed the telescope at the sky, none of that mattered. The universe opened up above them, vast and beautiful, indifferent to human prejudices and fears. "I see it!" Caleb shouted with excitement. "I see Saturn! I see the rings!" Kennedy looked through the telescope herself, and there it was, that distant planet with its impossible rings, a reminder that the universe was bigger and stranger and more wonderful than any human could fully comprehend. "Reaper said when you ride across the country on a motorcycle, you feel small, but in a good way," Caleb said, still staring up at the stars. "Like you're part of something bigger." "I think he's right," Kennedy said. They stayed out until Caleb's eyes started drooping, then headed back inside. As Kennedy tucked her son into bed, his new dinosaur sheets already on, the result of an impromptu bedroom upgrade, Caleb grabbed her hand. "Mom, I'm glad I helped Reaper, even if it scared you." "I'm glad. I'm glad too, baby. So glad." Caleb fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the emotional roller coaster of the day. Kennedy stayed by his bed for a while, watching him breathe, thinking about the strange and wonderful turn their lives had taken. She thought about the money in her purse, the food in her refrigerator, the toys in her living room. But more than the material gifts, she thought about the lesson embedded in the day's events, that sometimes the people society tells you to fear are the ones who'll show you the most humanity. The next morning, Kennedy woke to find Caleb already up, wearing his new jeans and the leather vest that Chains had given him, even though it hung almost to his knees. He was standing in front of the mirror trying to look tough, and Kennedy had to cover her mouth to keep from laughing. "What are you doing, baby?" "Practicing," Caleb said seriously. "If I'm going to be an honorary Hell's Angel, I gotta look the part." "Honorary Hell's Angel?" "Chains said I was little brother now. That means I'm part of the family." Caleb turned to his mother. "Is that okay? Can I be part of their family too?" Kennedy knelt down to his level, adjusting the vest that swallowed his small frame. "Yeah, sweetie, I think that's more than okay." Over the following weeks, the story of what happened spread through Riverside like ripples in a pond, reaching far beyond the immediate neighborhood. The local newspaper got wind of it and ran a story. "Local Boys' Kindness Bridges Community Divide." The article featured a photo of Caleb standing between Reaper and Chains, grinning broadly, the oversized vest hanging on him like a badge of honor. The story was picked up by regional news, then state news, then, impossibly, it went viral on social media. People shared it with comments like, "This is what we need more of," and "Kids see what adults can't," and "Maybe we should all be more like this kid." But for Kennedy and Caleb, life continued in its rhythms. School, work, homework, dinner, with the addition of occasional visits from members of the Riverside Hells Angels chapter. Reaper stopped by one evening to help Kennedy fix her car's rattling problem, refusing to accept payment. Brutus brought over a basketball hoop and installed it in the complex courtyard, staying to shoot hoops with Caleb and several other neighborhood kids who'd overcome their initial fear. Chains showed up one Saturday with Tommy and took Caleb to a motorcycle show, treating the 8-year-old like visiting royalty and introducing him to riders from chapters across California. Caleb collected more little brother vests from different chapters, each one a slightly different design, and he wore them with fierce pride. The relationship between the Morrison family and the Hells Angels became a fixture of neighborhood life, so normal that it stopped being remarkable. Mrs. Fletcher began waving to Reaper when he visited. Mr. Bradley asked Chains for advice about his own motorcycle. The young couple upstairs asked if their daughter could ride along on one of the group's charity toy drives. Kennedy found that her perspective on a lot of things had shifted. She caught herself making assumptions about people: a homeless man on the corner, a teenager with too many piercings, a woman with a full face of tattoos, and she'd stop, remember that morning in the parking lot, and reconsider. 3 months after the visit, the Riverside Hells Angels organized a community day at the apartment complex. Free motorcycle rides for kids, a barbecue, bike maintenance workshops, and a fundraiser for the elementary school. What could have been an intimidating display of biker culture instead became a celebration of community, breaking down walls that had existed for generations. Kennedy volunteered at the event, working the food table alongside Chain's wife Maria, a soft-spoken woman with silver jewelry and a master's degree in education. They talked about their kids, their jobs, their dreams for the future, just two mothers trying to do right by their families. "You know what Vincent told me?" Maria said at one point, flipping burgers. "He said your Caleb reminded him why he started the chapter in the first place. It wasn't about rebellion or reputation. It was about creating a family for people who didn't fit anywhere else, about building something good." "Caleb has a gift for seeing the good in people," Kennedy said, watching her son across the courtyard, sitting on Reaper's parked Harley and pretending to drive, while a circle of kids watched in envy. "No," Maria corrected gently. "Caleb has the gift of not seeing the bad first. There's a difference. Most of us have been taught to see the scary, the dangerous, the different. Your son somehow missed that lesson, or maybe he just refused to learn it." Kennedy thought about that as she served hot dogs to neighbors who months ago would have crossed the street to avoid the men now flipping burgers and playing with children. Maria was right. Caleb hadn't learned to see monsters where there were only people. That wasn't naivety. That was wisdom. As the sun set on the community day, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Caleb found his mother in the crowd and tugged her hand. "Mom, Chains said they do a big ride every year to deliver toys to kids in hospitals. Can I go with them?" Kennedy's first instinct was to say no. He was too young. It was too far. What if something happened? But she caught herself, looked at Chains, who was watching the interaction with patient understanding, and thought about all the assumptions she'd almost made that morning, months ago. "We'll talk about it," she said, which in parent language meant, "Probably yes, but let me think." Caleb accepted this with the wisdom of a child who knew his mother and ran off to help Brutus clean up the courtyard. "He'll be safe with us," Chains said quietly, appearing at Kennedy's side. "Safer than in most places, honestly. We protect our own." "I'm beginning to understand that," Kennedy replied. As the Hells Angels began the process of packing up, Reaper approached Kennedy with something in his hand, a photograph. It showed Caleb and Reaper on that first day, pushing the broken Harley down Market Street, caught by someone's camera phone. Caleb's face was scrunched with effort. Reaper was looking back at him with an expression of pure wonder. "I want you to have this," Reaper said, "so you remember." "Remember what?" "That your kid is something special, that he sees the world the way it should be, not the way we've made it. Don't let the world teach him different." Kennedy took the photograph, her eyes stinging with tears yet again. "I won't," she promised. That night, after the last motorcycle had rumbled away and the apartment complex settled back into quiet normalcy, Kennedy and Caleb sat together on their couch, surrounded by the remnants of the day's celebration. "Did you have fun today?" Kennedy asked. "The best fun," Caleb said, then yawned hugely. "Mom, why did everyone used to be scared of Reaper and his friends?" "Because people judge books by their covers. We see leather and tattoos and motorcycles and think dangerous before we think person. That's dumb." Kennedy laughed. "Yeah, baby, it really is." "I'm glad I helped push the motorcycle," Caleb said sleepily, leaning against his mother. "I made new friends." "You did more than that," Kennedy said, stroking his hair. "You reminded a lot of people, including me, how to see others with kindness instead of fear." But Caleb was already asleep, his small chest rising and falling peacefully, dreaming perhaps of motorcycles and stars, and a world where helping someone who needed it was never questioned, never feared, always celebrated. Kennedy carried him to bed, tucked him in, and stood at his doorway for a long moment, thinking about the chain of events that had started with a broken motorcycle and a child's simple offer to help. She thought about Chain's words that first morning. "When we do right, nobody remembers. When we do wrong, nobody forgets." Well, Riverside would remember this. The whole town would remember the day 90 Hells Angels rode in, not with violence or intimidation, but with gratitude and generosity. They'd remember a little boy who saw past prejudice to offer kindness. They'd remember that sometimes the monsters in our stories are just people waiting to be seen. And maybe, just maybe, that remembering would change things, one motorcycle, one act of kindness, one challenged assumption at a time.